as it has been announced that legendary music mogul Clive Davis has died at the age of 94.
There is a moment that happens in every great life, a moment so quiet, so private, that the rest of the world almost misses it entirely. For Clive Davis, that moment came on June 22, 2026, inside his Manhattan home, surrounded by the people he loved most. He was 94 years old. The city outside kept moving, kept breathing, kept playing its music. And the man who had spent nearly 7 decades deciding what that music would sound like was gone. His family released a statement shortly after. And when people read it, really read it, something happened that you don't often see in the cold, transactional world of the music industry. People cried. Journalists cried. Artists who had known him for decades cried. Because what his children wrote wasn't a press release. It wasn't a carefully managed public relations moment. It was something raw and honest and deeply human. They wrote that to the world, their father was an iconic music legend whose vision and instincts shaped the soundtrack of countless lives. But to them, he was simply Dad. The steady presence at the center of their world. The source of wisdom, strength, and unconditional love. That contrast, between the towering public figure and the devoted father, is really what this story is about. Because Clive Davis was both of those things, fully and completely, until the very end. And what he left behind when he died was not simply a staggering fortune, though the fortune is absolutely staggering. What he left behind was a life so completely and so purposefully lived that it becomes almost impossible to summarize without feeling the weight of it. So let's try anyway. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than most people realize. Clive J. Davis was born on April 4, 1932, in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. His father Herman was an electrician who also sold ties on the road to make ends meet. His mother Florence kept the household together. It was a working-class life, modest and decent, and for a while, it was enough. But then tragedy arrived early and without mercy. By the time Clive was a teenager, both of his parents had died. Not one, both. Gone within 2 years of each other. He was a boy in Brooklyn with no parents and nowhere obvious to go, and he moved in with his older married sister in Queens. Now, you have to understand what that kind of loss does to a person. It can break you. It can hollow you out and leave you drifting. For a lot of kids, losing both parents before finishing high school is the end of the story, or at least the end of any story worth telling. But Clive Davis was not built that way. Whatever grief he carried it forward. He got himself into New York University, threw himself into his studies with a focus that bordered on ferocious, and graduated magna cum laude in 1953 with a degree in political science. Then, and this is where the story starts to feel genuinely cinematic, he earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. A full scholarship. The orphan from Brooklyn was going to Harvard, but he graduated from Harvard Law in 1956 and began practicing at a New York firm. That should have been the entire story. A lawyer with a Harvard degree and a good firm has a very comfortable life ahead of him. But fate had different plans, and fate used a law client as its instrument. His firm represented CBS, and through that relationship, Davis was brought in as assistant counsel for CBS's subsidiary, Columbia Records, in 1960. He was 28 years old, and he had just accidentally walked into the music business. What happened next was not accidental at all. Davis moved through Columbia Records the way water moves through a landscape, finding every available path upward, reshaping the terrain as he went. From assistant counsel, he moved to general counsel. From general counsel to administrative vice president. And then, in 1967, at 35 years old, he was named president of Columbia Records. The lawyer from Brooklyn, the kid who had grown up without parents and worked his way through 2 elite universities on pure determination, was now running one of the most powerful record labels in the world. And here is the thing that made Clive Davis different from every other executive in that building: he actually listened. Most people who rise through the business side of the music industry have what you might call a comfortable relationship with music. They appreciate it, they understand its commercial value, they can recognize a hit when they hear one played on the radio 6 times a day. Davis had something else entirely. He had an instinct. An almost eerie ability to sit in a club or a rehearsal space or a dingy recording studio and hear something in an artist that hadn't yet become visible to anyone else. The industry would come to call it a golden ear, and it was real that at Columbia, he signed Janis Joplin and championed her as one of the defining voices of her generation. He brought Santana into the fold and watched them become one of the most enduring live acts in music history. He recognized something in a young New Jersey writer named Bruce Springsteen before the rest of America had caught up. He signed Billy Joel. He signed Earth, Wind and Fire. He signed Aerosmith after seeing them perform at a small New York venue called Max's Kansas City, and the band never forgot it. They literally wrote his name into a song years later as a tribute to the man who gave them their shot. That roster alone would be enough to define an entire career. But Davis was nowhere near finished at IN 1973, his time at Columbia ended in the worst possible way. He was fired. A scandal involving alleged misuse of company funds became very public, very messy, and very damaging. A man who had spent years building Columbia into a dominant cultural force was suddenly out, and the music industry, which is not always known for its loyalty or its long memory, began to wonder if that was the end of Clive Davis. That it was not the end of Clive Davis. That in 1974, just 1 year after being pushed out of Columbia, he founded Arista Records. And what he proceeded to build at Arista over the next quarter century was not a comeback. Comebacks are for people who settle for returning to where they were. What Davis built at Arista was something new, a label that became one of the defining institutions of American popular music for 3 full decades. He launched Barry Manilow's recording career and helped him become one of the best-selling adult contemporary artists of all time. He signed Patti Smith and gave the punk and poetry world a home. He brought Aretha Franklin to Arista when many in the industry had written her off commercially, and she promptly proved everyone wrong. He signed acts that spanned rock, pop, soul, R&B, and everything in between, because his taste was never limited to a single genre. His instincts were broader than that. But then came the moment that would define not just his career at Arista, but his entire legacy. In 1983, Clive Davis walked into a small Manhattan nightclub called Sweet Waters. There was a young woman performing that night as part of her mother's cabaret act. She was 19 years old. She had never released a record. She had no album, no management deal, no industry profile of any kind. She was just a voice, but what a voice. Clive Davis listened, and in the way that only happened for him, in that particular way that had served him his entire career, he knew. He signed her that night. Her name was Whitney Houston. What followed over the next 3 decades is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of recorded music. Whitney Houston went on to sell over 200 million records worldwide. She became one of the defining vocalists of the 20th century. She won Grammy Awards and broke chart records and filled stadiums on every continent. And through all of it, every album, every era, every high and every difficult chapter, Clive Davis was there. He didn't just sign her and step back. He curated. He helped choose songs. He shaped the arc of her recording career with the same careful attention a sculptor gives to a piece of marble. He stayed close to her personally as well as professionally, and their bond was one of the most significant relationships of both their lives. When Whitney Houston died tragically in February 2012, Davis was devastated in the way you are only devastated by the loss of someone who was genuinely central to your world. Years later, in 2022, when a biopic of Whitney Houston's life was released, titled I Wanna Dance with Somebody, the character of Clive Davis was portrayed by acclaimed actor Stanley Tucci. Davis himself served as a producer on the film. Even in telling her story after her death, he made sure it was told right. Arista Records remained his home base for years, but Davis never stopped building. In 1989, he co-founded LaFace Records alongside producers L.A. Reid and Kenneth "Babyface" Edmonds, and that label became a cultural force of its own in the 1990s and early 2000s. TLC, Toni Braxton, and Usher all came through LaFace, and each of them became defining artists of their era. The combination of Davis's instincts and Reid and Edmonds's production genius created some of the most commercially successful and culturally significant music of that entire decade. Then in 2000, after his time at Arista came to a close, he launched J Records. The name itself tells you something important about who Clive Davis was as a person. He named it after the letter J, his middle initial, which he shared with each of his 4 children. In an industry famous for its ego and its ruthlessness, here was one of the most powerful men in the business naming his new label after the thing he shared with his kids at ATJ Records. He introduced a then unknown 20-year-old named Alicia Keys to the world, and she arrived fully formed, a songwriter and pianist of extraordinary depth who immediately announced herself as a generational talent. He also helped revitalize the careers of Luther Vandross and Rod Stewart, proving once again that his instincts weren't tied to youth or novelty. He responded to talent wherever it was, regardless of age or commercial fashion. In 2001, the music industry voted him the #1 A&R executive on the planet. He was 68 years old. Let's talk about the fortune, because it is genuinely extraordinary, and because understanding how it was built helps explain just how comprehensively Clive Davis shaped the business of music over his lifetime. According to widely cited estimates, Davis left behind a net worth in the range of $850 million. with some sources suggesting the true figure may be even closer to 900 million. That number is the product of many decades and many revenue streams, all working together over a career that stretched from 1960 until the final years of his life. The foundation was the executive compensation. Davis served as president of Columbia Records, founder and president of Arista Records, chairman and CEO of the RCA Music Group, and chief creative officer of Sony Music Entertainment. Each of those positions, held at the top of some of the most powerful companies in entertainment, came with substantial salaries and bonuses over many decades. When you hold senior executive positions in major corporations for more than 60 years, the compensation accumulates in ways that are difficult to overstate. Then there was the equity. When you found a record label, you don't just collect a paycheck, you own a piece of something. Arista Records was Clive Davis's company, and the financial upside of owning equity in a label that dominated the charts for more than 2 decades is enormous. The returns on that investment alone would have secured his wealth many times over. But Davis was not simply a music executive who kept his money in a bank account. He was a thoughtful and strategic investor who understood that wealth preservation required diversification. He assembled an art collection over the decades that included works by Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, and Andy Warhol, artists whose work has only increased in value over time, and whose combined presence in a single private collection represents a portfolio worth well over $100 million by most expert estimates. Art, unlike many other asset classes, tends to appreciate quietly and reliably over long periods, and Davis understood this. Real estate was another significant pillar of his wealth. He owned a stunning duplex apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, one of the most valuable residential addresses in one of the most expensive cities in the world. He also maintained an estate in Pound Ridge in Westchester County, New York, a property that offered space and privacy outside the city. But his real estate interests went well beyond his personal residences. Davis founded Park Royal Capital, a private equity firm with a specific focus on commercial real estate, and built a portfolio that included close to 2,000 units in multifamily housing communities. This was not passive investment. This was active wealth building by a man who understood numbers as well as he understood music. And then there is the ongoing income that flows from the music itself. When you spend 60 years shaping the careers of artists who collectively sell hundreds of millions of records, the royalty streams attached to that catalog of music do not simply stop when you retire or when you die. They continue. They compound. Whitney Houston's music is still being streamed and downloaded and licensed every single day. So is Springsteen's. So is Alicia Keys. So is the music of dozens of other artists whose careers Davis shaped over his lifetime. That ongoing income, steady, reliable, and essentially permanent, is part of what makes a music executive's estate so different from most other kinds of wealth. $850 million. It's a number that sounds almost abstract until you understand the decades of work and instinct and risk and vision that built it. But the fortune, as remarkable as it is, was never the thing that defined Clive Davis in the eyes of the people who knew him best. What defined him to his family was something much simpler and much harder to quantify. Davis was married twice. His first marriage, to Helen Cohen, lasted from 1956 to 1965. His second marriage, to Janet Adelberg, lasted from 1965 to 1985. Both marriages ended in divorce, but both gave him something he treasured above everything else in his professional life: children.